Okay, everybody, I wanted to take a minute here and kind of give you a few comments on the issue of biometrics that is covered in our discussion. Biometrics is defined as the science and technology of measuring and analyzing biological data. Information technology, biometrics refers to technology that measure and analyze human body characteristics such as DNA, fingerprints, irises, voice patterns, facial patterns, and hand measurement for authentication purposes. Now, I will say that, we've made a ton of advances in this area recently, and can be very helpful in the area of identifying terrorists and this type of thing using the facial recognition software. But there are also, as many of you brought up in the discussion, problems and issues with biometrics that can be problematic for all of us. Biometric devices, for example, the finger scanner, it has a reader or scanning device. It has software that converts that information into a digital form, and then it compares those match points in your fingerprint. They have a database that stores the data, and then in a matter of seconds it can compare fingerprints. So I think this is very important information for both the civil side of the law and the criminal side. You can see this from a crime prevention standpoint. There is a whole field called CPTED, which is Crime Prevention Through Technology and Environmental Design. So if you design, for example, an airport in such a way that you can have the people move through the airport smoothly, but still remain at a heightened level of security and safety, then this accomplishes all the goals of the whole design of that environment, which happens in this case to be an airport. In order to prevent identity theft, the biometric data is usually encrypted when it's gathered. And so that's how the biometric verification works. So that one of the things that you have to do, we talked a little bit about this already in the discussion. You've got to be very careful about things like passwords. We've just been getting bombarded recently, we being me, my colleagues, other professors, with these phony emails about how if you want to keep your email account, you've got to fill out this information, which of course includes your date of birth, your social security number, all this stuff. Well, that's ridiculous. There's no way that you need that. And usually the email that you're working with in any institution has a totally different setup. It never asks you for personal identification. So that's really one of the things you want to really be careful about, is that there's really some little ways that you think that you're doing the right thing, and basically, you need to keep that email account, for example, and you get these messages every once in a while. Well, I've gotten several of them in the last year. So you've just got to delete all those. You can't even look at them, don't even dig into them. It says your email account's about ready to expire. Sometimes if you look at it a little bit, you can see like where it came from. The address is an address you've never heard of before, totally unrelated. So you want to be very careful about that. Some of you have also mentioned things like from the future as far as Minority Report, where they're actually able to change the signs that you see when you're driving down the road or walking in a mall, just to appeal just to you, and that it changes really fast depending on who's walking by. A lot of that is a type of biometrics, and it can seem to be awfully intrusive. And there's also times, though, I was saying, I buy a lot of office supplies, as you can imagine, and when I teach, and I have to still do some printing for my own purposes and send things out in the mail and stuff like that. So I'm always buying envelope stamps and paper and things like that. And invariably in the mail, about a month after I buy some things, I get a coupon for 10% off the next time I go in to get printer ink or whatever. So, there's times where it can be helpful, it can be useful, but there's also times that it can be really bothersome. And that's where we've got to try to figure out, is just what do we want out of this technology. Well, I've got another short part that I wanted to touch on here, and that is this whole point about phrenology. Now, the reason I bring up phrenology, it's not mentioned anywhere in your book, it's not mentioned really anywhere except in my, tortured mind. But basically, just to give you a little bit of the history of biometrics, if you go back far enough, there was actually a guy, his name Dr. Franz Joseph Gall, who started a science, so-called science, it's actually called a pseudoscience, of looking at people's head. And so he was trying to identify future criminals by looking at their head. And when I say looking at their head, there's different bumps on the head in different places. And he had this theory that if you see these bumps on a person's head in a certain location, then it will mean that they're going to be a criminal in the future. So in a way, it kind of reminded me of phrenology when someone was saying about Minority Report. It's just another way using investigation of the physical aspects of the human body. And this was in the 19th century. This is way back in early 1800s up through the early 1900s that people ascribed to this phrenology, and that's spelled Phrenology. So if you're interested, Google on phrenology, again, Phrenology. And where he came up with this theory is he was asked to work with a number of pickpockets. And so he found, when he started doing physicals on these young pickpockets that are going off to prison and stuff, that he noticed that they had these certain bumps just above their ears that were kind of unusual. Most people don't have these bumps. And so he started to develop a theory that if you have these bumps in certain places on your head, it means you're going to be a criminal. And so he wrote a book on this. He made suggestions that certain parts of the brain affect moral and intellectual faculties of how we process information and our decision making and our own morality and our law abidingness. Violence, different things like that come from these bumps on the head. Well, the brain is a very complex organism, and one of the things that did come of this is it did raise a heightened interest, and actual neuroscience today is investigating this. And there's a lot of suggestions out there that frontal lobe damage, for example, which is in the front of the head, obviously, frontal lobe, can affect violence and cause people to be more violent. So this is a good example of where some of this early theorizing by early, basically, scientists or medical people does have some place in the actual answer to some of these questions. But the whole point of it is that what he did is, if you got a bump on your head, it really doesn't mean anything. Really, it's the opposite of a bump. There's actually a protrusion in the head that touches the brain and actually causes damage to the brain, a bruise or a scar, which in turn can cause you to be more violent. But I mean, he was on to something, so you can't, necessarily say that he knew what he's talking about, but on the other hand, he got us headed in the right direction. Well, this Gall, as I said, was involved in this in the early 1800s, and he actually died in 1828. But, I mean, he had a big part in starting to move our thinking in the direction of looking at, the physical makeup of the human being as being a part of the determinant about whether they're going to be a criminal. And I think that, it kind of underlies all this other, like biometrics and stuff. It's taken it a step further than maybe what we were thinking about, is just identifying actual criminals, but on the other hand, what we're trying to do is predict. So we get pretty far out from what the current methodology of biometrics is, which is just identify a terrorist, identify a criminal based on their fingerprint, based on their DNA, and other physical traits like that. But the actual original thing of identifying a criminal with their actual physical traits was by this Dr. Franz Joseph Gall. So that kind of gives you the whole story on biometrics and where it came from and where it's going. I think it can be a good thing, but it's one of those things just like anything else. It's like a two-edged sword. There's a good edge, which is, protecting society, but there's a bad edge that if the bad guys can figure out how to defeat it, then, they can disrupt and misdirect the law into the wrong direction. For example, and this is my last comment, if you look at fingerprinting, for example, people for a long time have used like wax to burn off their fingerprints, or they've even also been able now modernly to use things like glue and stuff to actually change their fingerprint, take on other fingerprints and so forth. So it's one of those things that we have to watch carefully. One thing I would say, based upon my own experience with urine tests that we had to do when I was a city attorney, is one thing is you have to have close scrutiny of people when they're engaged in these tests, because just like with the urine test, people were let to go into the bathroom and have their privacy, and who knows what they were doing in there. They could be pouring water into the test tube, they could be dipping it out of the toilet. I mean, they could be doing anything, and it's intrusive. But if you're going to do a urine test on somebody, I mean, you got to watch them the whole time. So obviously appropriate that if you're having a woman take a test, a woman ought to watch. If it's a man, it ought to be a man. But other than that, I mean, you have to really engage in close scrutiny. So when you're seeing somebody being fingerprinted or whatever, don't allow for any kind of hanky-panky. The one thing, though, is if someone has altered their fingerprints, a lot of times they have an excuse, like, oh, well, I got burned. Well, you get burned on every finger, So these are all things that we have to look at as we move forward with engaging more and more in biometrics. I think it's important in terms of in the criminal law. I think it's also important from the civil law in terms of just good business practices for large corporations and so forth to identify customers, and also to identify people's identity, that hey, yeah, they can really use this credit card because that's really them. Told the story about myself when I was trying to buy an iced tea one time with my debit card and a sandwich, and I was in Maryland, and I get a phone call right away from my bank, which is located in San Antonio, and they're like, did you know that someone's trying to use your card right now in both Maryland and in Toronto? And the people in Toronto are trying to get $250 cash out of a cash machine. And I said, no, I'm in Maryland. I'm not in Toronto. I haven't only ever been in Toronto like 3 times in my whole life. So, there can be problems with this biometrics, and we have to be careful. So these password protections and things like that, you got to guard them carefully. Who knows how that came about? But I have a theory. One time I was up in Toronto and I bought something using my card, and I'm just wondering if they don't have a way to steal the information right off of that card and use it to get money or buy things or whatever. So anyway, that's the situation. Thanks for watching. Good luck with this. If you are kind of looking for a way to develop a way to pick up a few extra points, if you feel like you're not going to be successful in some areas of this class, feel free to expand on these last couple topics and send me a paper. Of course, you've got to follow all the rules, APA, cover, references, this type thing, but I'll be glad to consider a short paper from you for some additional points. So thanks for watching. Hope you got something out of this.